Я прежде всего хочу сказать огромное спасибо.
Let me thank Diana Pinto and Dominique Moisy, who have come to join us, who are among the inspirers of this school. They are much cherished friends who have brought us, myself and Yuri Sinokosov, to the Council of Europe, and who have come to make us acquainted with George Soros. Last year, Mr. Soros stopped the financial donation to the school, having rendered unwavering support to the school for many years. And I would like here, before this group, before this class, to thank Mr. Soros for the unique support that he has rendered to this school for years. Let me thank Dominique and Diana, who have introduced us to the European universe of expertise, friends and colleagues and donors. Let me thank Shirley Williams, who is here, one of the most prominent British politicians, Member of Parliament, Member of the House of Lords, former Minister in the Cabinet, and indeed one of the most perceptive liberal political scientists today. Shirley and her late husband, Mr. Richard Neustadt, have contributed greatly to the efficient and effective work of this school, to have given it an international status and recognition. By the way, Richard Neustadt is author of books who have been translated and published in Russian by this school, a person who was a political philosopher and who has endowed us with great books. And as they say, President Kennedy, as they say, had his presidential oath resting his hand on a book of Professor Neustadt. Well, it is hard to say if, what has indeed been contribution to the overall development of the political class in America, as we have some doubts about it today. However, we cannot help recognizing the great contribution. Let me thank Mr. Pierre Borghini, who is here with his wife, and thank Mr. Borghini, former mayor of Milano, one of the backbone cities of Italy, and when he was mayor, the school has had a unique opportunity to hold seminars almost in all regions of Italy, and we learned so much about the Italian state and the practice of Italian democracy. Well, the regional authorities today, unfortunately, in Russia are degenerating very fast, and so. But I can only express a hope that there'll be some memories kept to reintroduce it in Russia when the day comes. Let me thank Kalypso Nicolaïdis, whom I have met through Baroness Williams. Thank you, Kalypso, as we are introducing and inaugurating this seminar at St. Antony's College of Oxford University. Let me thank our great friends and interpreters, and the great team of the school, of the Moscow school, who have been with us for years. This school is a new creation every day. We recreate it and indeed make it happen every day. Let me give the floor to the host of this college, Kalypso Nicolaïdis. Thank you.
Lost in a balloon, over Europe. They're above. They don't know where they are. There's lots and lots of clouds, and suddenly there's an opening in the clouds. So maybe they'll know where they are. So they look down and they see these people and they say, "Hello, where are we?" And the people look up and say, "You're in a balloon." Doesn't help very much. You're in an amphitheater. Could be anywhere in the world. You could be back home, right? Well, but you're not. You're actually in an island. Not just Britain. Yes, Britain is an island. You've come all the way to this island. But you are in an island. And this island is Oxford City and Oxford University, because you're in Brexit land in Britain, but here you're in Remain land. This is a European university. And we're fighting very hard since the Brexit vote to remain European, inspired by British politicians like Shirley Williams, who has devoted a lifetime in making this country really part of the European project. And so in this context, it is in this context that I would like to say how happy and grateful I am to be able to welcome you here to Oxford University, to be part of the adventure that Lena, as well as Diana and Dominic and so many others, have shepherded for so many years since the end of the Cold War. It's quite a story to be part of something like that. And I'm sure you're super excited. And I see many women, not that I have nothing against guys, but it's really nice to see that there's so many women in this group. And I simply want to say two things. One is that in the 5 days that will come, you're going to have conversations in kind of three spheres that are in different ways talking about the relationship between Russia and the Russian sphere that you're part of, and our kind of European world and the rest of the world. One is geostrategic, and here it's all about conflict and tension, animosity sometimes. We want to understand what's going on. But the second is ideas, ideologies, identities, histories. Diana will speak very much about history tomorrow. And in that sense, there is perhaps much more that we understand that is shared, and including worldwide. But the third level is really, really important. The third level is the individual. It's me. Who am I? It's you. Each one of you in this room, you have a European story. You have a global story. You have a story about how you relate to the world. Most of you are journalists. You tell these stories. You're storytellers. And my biggest frustration at this moment in time is that I'm not going to hear most of your stories, but I hope this afternoon we'll continue the conversation. So there are these three levels, and indeed that's what we do also here with our students and colleagues at Oxford University. Simply for you to understand where you are, you're told you're at St. Antony's College. Well, St. Antony's College is one of 39 colleges of Oxford University. And some of these colleges go back 800 years. Some were created 50 years ago. And each college is very wanting to protect its sovereignty, just like states in the international system or in the EU. But they also realize they need to collaborate and work together sometimes. So Oxford is like a microcosm, really, of the world and the crazy world we're in, of our predicament. It has, beyond colleges, also centers. So I'm a part of the European Center, which after the Cold War what before was called the West European Center and then became the it was called the Western European Center and then it had to become the European Center, however far that goes. But I personally am against the notion that somehow there are spheres of influence. You know, we have to kind of work together, and we're going to talk much more about this, I think, in the next few days. So without further ado, and really in welcoming you very much in our Oxford University, in this little extraterritorial island, I would like to anyway just encourage you to participate and very much pass the floor on to my dear friend Shirley Williams.
You would like to have microphone, maybe microphone. You would like to sit upstairs, but you can't.
Do you want this one or this one?
This one.
Nice to see you all here, and I'm delighted you've managed to get here. I think it's very impressive of you. You've taken great chances, great risks to come here, and you are in fact the basis of keeping the whole seminar, the civic education seminar that started life in the Moscow School of Political Studies 30 years ago. You've taken the chance of keeping that going. It's a very important part of Russia's future relations with the rest of the world. I want to tell you one little story about Lena Nemirovskaya, who's sitting beside me, who's a great friend, but has also been all the way through committed to the whole idea of political education, in internationalism, in democracy, and in many other things. And that civic education has extended with the support of her son-in-law and others over many years now, and has been an essential part of understanding a world which is necessarily international. It's been a long, hard struggle, and for many people, including many of those who voted for President Trump in the United States, the problem has been one in which they have essentially seen nation states, the basis of the old history, as the functions that they had to go through. In other words, this was the central loyalty of many, many citizens. What they have tried to do, and this is important, I think, is to recognize that, like it or not, and many people do not like globalization, it has forced upon us a whole set of politics which are to do with recognizing the international relations of one country with another. And perhaps even more important, I think perhaps central, the concept that globalization itself should throw up new kinds of moral laws, new kinds of philosophy, new kinds of approaches to politics, which is very difficult for most of us to get used to. I'll come back to say a bit more about that, because whether it's Russia or whether it's the United Kingdom, what one sees is this struggle between the attempt to go back to the old nationalisms and the requirement of the modern world, including the technical modern world, that there have to be rules of behavior, attitudes, values, which are far beyond that of one nation state and are part of what it is to be the new world which we're entering. The European Union is one of the initial pioneers of this process, an attempt to try to create a group of nations which together can become a new federation or a new grouping, which has very clear rules which have to be kept and which are laid down by a process of consultation and discussion, including with the European Parliament in the case of the European Union. So that what one is seeing, what we are seeing today, is the period between an absence of rules, a lack of acceptance of rules which are outside the nation state, into a world which has got rules that are applied across more generally the whole of many countries in such a way that we live again in a civilized world. We are at the moment, I think, in what the great French historian Marais called a gulf between eras. We've come out of an era which was essentially nationalist or imperialist in some cases into one which requires us to understand what it is to actually make a civilized outcome of the modern world. Let me just say one more thing about that, because I think it's very important. And that is that some countries, your own is among them, Russia, so is mine, United Kingdom, are struggling with trying to reconcile this new world that is coming with the old world in which they were so important, such great powers. Russia is still, I think, torn between whether it essentially belongs to the Eurasian mass or should be part of Europe as well. It hasn't made its mind up, and its people haven't made their minds up. And so we have this sense of lack of clarity, lack of clearness about what we're for and what we're doing. In the United Kingdom, this rather similarly in one way, coming out of a very long imperial era, one that lasted for 2 centuries, where this small country became much greater than itself, where it had a sense to draw upon its history to see itself as what it could be. It's been very difficult to get people to reconcile themselves to the passing of empire. I think the same is true in Russia, of the passing of the Russian state as a great power. And all of us who are here, especially those of you who are younger people, have a great responsibility to try to create a structure which will last through many decades to come, which will enable you to take advantage from the new technologies that are coming. It will also make it clear that in that structure, including new technologies, one of the things that Lena said and that Kalypso said, which is the significance and the importance of the individual citizen, have got to be protected and rescued from simply being cast aside. Now let me go back for a minute to tell you one little story about Lena, who is a great friend of mine and for whom I have huge admiration. A Russian patriot, without any doubt. Her love for Russia is very strong, but also somebody who sees the challenges that come from globalization, the challenges that come from an international academic understanding, increasingly an intellectual world where there is discussion, openness, consultation, one among another. But let me just say one word about how it all began. After the end of the Second World War, Elena was determined that there should be in Russia a movement towards more democracy, a greater acceptance of the voice of the individual. And she went to the Council of Europe, which was at that time in Strasbourg, in order to get the help that she needed to try to establish what she then did establish, along with her wonderful husband Yuri. That is to say, the concept of a civic education that would go far beyond one nation state, even a great nation state like Russia, which looked beyond that to what the world itself might become. The globalization, which was essentially geographic, was to become a globalization that was essentially intellectual, spiritual, political. She sat for several days on the outside of the office in Strasbourg of the Council of Europe. Don't forget, the Council of Europe is not the same thing as the European Union. It's quite different, it's much wider, and it's always included Russia and other countries as well. It has always been the fundamental institution which was open, committed, and essentially looking for this wider world, which incidentally had partly come out of the work of people like Franklin Roosevelt, who took the United States into the United Nations. Essentially, as you know, after the First World War, there was a failure of the United States to take any large part in the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations. But what happened after the Second World War was much more constructive. Russia and America were talking to one another, certainly for very different philosophical bases. But what they were essentially trying to do, and I think I can put this as strongly as possible, they were building a world of principles and laws which were shared between nations. Not one for one nation imposed on others, in the way that, for example, Nazi Germany tried to do, but rather a structure which was global, which matched the challenges of the economy, becoming international, the global economy, with a political structure that was able to lay down the limits and the rules of the way in which that occurred and was run. So when she sat on these steps of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, and she sat there on the steps, as any of us might have done, like a rough sleeper, what happened was that the leader at that time, the head of the Council of Europe's work, looked at the presence of this unknown Russian lady and asked her staff who she was and what she was doing there. And they didn't know the answer. They couldn't say, we know who this lady is, she's the leading politician in Russia or something. No. They knew she was Russian, they knew very little more about her. Lena had actually taken buses and trucks and other ways of getting to Strasbourg in the cheapest way she could, because she had very little money and very little support from nation states. She wasn't herself a national or even an international politician. And after a while, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe became interested after 2 or 3 days. Here was this Russian lady still sitting on the steps, still waiting for someone to talk to her. She said to her staff, and it's to her great credit, shows what a great lady she was, that she then said, I want her brought to my study and we will talk. I want to know why she's sitting here waiting for something significant to happen. Don't forget that Russia was already in great difficulties economically, was struggling to recover from what had been a terribly expensive and difficult war, and Russia, I think, has got more and more credit for the way in which it handled the Second World War. And she was taken into the Secretary General's office and asked what she was there for. And she explained that what she was there for was to create a new intellectual framework for a new post-First World War, Second World War Russia, and that she wanted help to create a civic education that would enable young Russians to be part of this global world and not simply part of the old national world. She was supported by the Secretary General, amazingly, who was French, given support for things like this you are at the present time. You are the end, not the end, but at least a staging post in a remarkable history. And she therefore was given by the Secretary General support for the very first seminar that the Council of Europe did for Russians. It's really a significant step. But it wasn't just a significant step for the school or for Russia. It was essentially the first step in the attempt to create a world of principles and rules that went beyond the nation state. In other words, it was in some ways a revolutionary, radical concept which Lena all her life has given herself to, which other people like Kalypso have been part of and enjoyed and become in existence. I have to say now, to leap forward a minute, whether I look at Russia or whether I look at the United Kingdom, that both of us are suffering from trying to come to terms with this political revolution. We aren't there. In some ways, like in the United States, where President Trump is talking about America first, we're reverting backwards to what one might call the 19th century. In Britain, one would call it the Victorian age. In other words, we are still living with the burden of our history. That history was remarkable in Russia. It was remarkable also in the United Kingdom. It made both of us into world states. But we never got beyond being world states. We never understood what it was to be part of a democratic, open, discussing world where we were together trying to build these new relationships. Let me take just one example, which is the example that I know best. All my life long, sorry, sir, you're waving your mic in the air.
Can you talk into the microphone, please? Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear better now? I'm so sorry. Did others hear? Put your hand up if you couldn't hear at all. No, okay. I'll plough on for a bit. I think what happened in the particular case I'm thinking of was the example of nuclear weapons. Not nuclear power in the energy sense, but nuclear weapons. We've struggled towards trying to create a structure which limits the use of nuclear weapons. We've struggled towards, for example, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is still in existence, but which is very, very full of holes. It doesn't hold very well together. We're going back to a situation where the nuclear weapon is used as a threat, not one that's actually used much, but which is used very strongly as a political way to express a nation's power. Perhaps the most extraordinary example of that, and one of the silliest, was the discussion between Mr. Trump, the President of the United States now, and, as you probably all know, the head of North Korea, about who had the bigger nuclear button. Of all silly discussions one could possibly have, that one would be laughable if it wasn't so serious, but it is sadly truly serious. And at the moment, I think the United States and Russia both are extending the how can I put it, the potential of what nuclear weapons could do to a country in order to use this as a form of political expression. It's not a form of political expression. It becomes a form of something very close to military aggression, but is not actually military at the present time. Now, what all this was about was whether we could recreate what we tried to do in the first few years after the Second World War, when Russia and the United States were still talking to one another, when the Cold War hadn't actually settled in, when we were both attempting to try to work together, when we were both attempting to strengthen the United Nations and other such bodies. But it then fell apart, essentially, in the latter years, in the years of the 60s and 70s, when we settled down to the concept of the Cold War. And the Cold War, I think, did immense harm to the attempt to try to communicate, to try to build a global sense of what we were all about. And I think that we have only just emerged to some extent from that and are now going back to some extent into it. Let me just pick on for a moment on Russia. Kalypso said a bit about the regional factors in Russia, and so did Lena. In particular, the weakening of the regional autonomy, which was such an important part of what new Russia was becoming. One of the things the school taught me, and one of the great things about Lena's and Yuri's school, was that they made it quite clear that they did not wish all the meetings of civic education in Russia to be based on Moscow. For a lot of the world, Moscow is Russia, but it isn't. And you know that better than I do. And one of the things I found out and was very impressed by, one of the things I found out was indeed very impressed by, and I hope we will consider and discuss it very carefully, was the way in which different regions of Russia came up with different ideas, different policies, different relationships. I remember how extremely impressed I was when I went for the first time to Siberia and discovered in Irkutsk the levels of tolerance, of mutual understanding, of willingness to communicate between different religious denominations, but also between different political attitudes, in a way that I found tremendously exciting and very enlightening about Russia. In other words, I hadn't realized the extent to which I should have realized that Russia was a country which was based upon brilliant ideas, brilliant thoughts, brilliant experience in different regions. It wasn't a single mono state in which the same values, the same attitudes appeared everywhere. And when people came, your predecessors, sometimes some of you yourselves, from all over Russia, from the far west to the far east and north and south, one suddenly saw that this was essentially a country which had some of the aspects of federalism, by which I mean contributions to the structure of politics and the state, which recognized that there were these differences and recognized that many of these differences were extremely creative. So I suddenly realized that Russia was a much, much bigger country, not just geographically or huge, but intellectually and politically, and with very great differences between people from different parts of the country. And that this was the basis on which you could build a new and much more open Russia, because you had such a variety of attitudes, such a variety of approaches, such a variety of moral attitudes too. I think, but please correct me if you think I'm wrong, because one of the things about a seminar of this kind is that nobody is prevented from saying what they believe to be true. They're only prevented if they aren't telling truth but telling lies. And those lies become propaganda, and you will hear more about that later in the seminar when we have British and European journalists joining us to talk about how they deal with the whole structure of the media and of communication. But we haven't got there yet. What I was trying to say about this was that I think that one of the things that emerged out of all this, and what is true about Russia at the present time, is that Russia has got several potential loyalties. I'll say that again. Russia, I think, has got several potential loyalties. In other words, it hasn't settled to any one of them. One of them is its relationship to Europe. particularly Western Europe, which is rather different from Eastern Europe. In many ways, Eastern Europe has been very much influenced by Russia being there, by Russian occupation and so forth. Western Europe is a more distinct political grouping, and one with a very, very long history. A long history of war, it must be said, as well as a long history of politics and in some cases of democracy. Russia, I think, is attracted to some extent to Western Europe, wishes to be an influential part of it, but the step all the way to the European Union, which I will come to in a minute, is a step too far at the present time. So Russia essentially has clung to things like the Council of Europe, bodies which are much wider than one country or one group of countries, but it still hasn't quite clearly decided what its relationship to Western Europe ought to be. And I think that goes for Western Europe the other way. For example, what is the role of countries like Poland, Hungary, and so on, which are members of the European Union, but in some ways are slightly out of their typical area in dealing with the consequences of that. For example, Hungary has pursued a policy which is very nationalistic, although it's a member of the European Union. And other members of the European Union, like Germany, would find that really difficult to accept. So that's one element of Russia's relationship to the global world. It hasn't decided completely, and I hope you'll talk about that, where it belongs, where it's close to, where it feels contented or happy. You then get the rise of China. Very striking that China last year had a growth rate of nearly 7% a year, which is the fastest in the world by any standard. And that growth rate, which is propelling China into becoming the key global player in the Pacific world, in the world of the East. We don't know where it will begin or end. Clearly it has a very strong leader, as you do in Mr. Putin, a very strong leader who is also nationalistic, but has not yet quite decided what his relationship to the countries around him ought to be. And if I may say so, and I made this point before, but I'll make it again because I think Diana will talk about it, the extent to which in countries like Russia or the United Kingdom, history leans on them, travels on their backs, because people are continually reminded of where they were, what they came from, and so forth. Whether it's having been a great war country like Russia, or a great imperial colonial country like Britain, it's quite hard to lose that commitment to one's past in looking at the future. And that's one of the things, again, you need to talk about. The third thing I think you need to talk about, and it's extraordinary, it's still very hard to grasp completely, is of course the impact of technology, and in particular the impact of technology in the sense of the so-called social networks, which try to reach out to people, but do it in a way that also commits them to a set of attitudes towards technology, which in some ways can be rather scary, even frightening. That's a third thing you need to look at. You're going to be part of that generation that decides what one does about robots, what one does about international technology in the different ways in which it's emerging, and what that does to the, if you like, the ancient Greek concept of the priority of the individual human being, what it does to human beings as a race and as a people. The last thing I want to talk about, which I hope you'll also discuss in considerable detail, is that how the younger generation, I'm sorry, do it again if you want to, the younger generation, which is much more at ease with advanced technology, how it works with the older generation, which is still basically the generation that is in power at the national level. It isn't easy. The discussion between the two is really very difficult and very strained, I think, in a way that rather challenges almost all our thinking and that we haven't come to terms with. I'll end by saying this. I come obviously from a very old democratic country, the United Kingdom. The parliament which I belonged to for 34 years, 40 years, was founded originally in the very first building where the first parliament met in Britain was in 1215, rather a long time ago. And that meant that, and it's gone on ever since, it's been a consistent, continuing structure. Now, in some ways, that makes it harder for people to think anew, because the structure's been there for so long, and it's been so stable, and so solid, and continued, eventually including women, then including people of other races, then people competing for other countries. So it's become familiar. And that brings me to the last part of what I want to say. I've talked a bit about the challenges that Russia confronts, and in particular the challenges of where it belongs, to whom it belongs, how it acts with the countries with which it has interrelationship. In the case of the United Kingdom, the problem is a different one. It's the problem of whether we should continue to be part of the European Union. Let me say something about that. The European Union, in many ways, was a remarkable political innovation. It went back to the whole idea of something which was above the nation state, the national government, to a structure where countries brought together, worked out what they agreed on, decided how to act as international force, and that's been true and very important, and it's been particularly a shaping of modern France and even more of modern Germany. I would say that Germany, in my view, is the most transformed country in the world, the one that has gone furthest away from where it came and has climbed better than any other out of the horrors of the Second World War, of the First World War, but also of the Nazi regime. The Germans have really broken with that. They are a new country in the strongest sense of the word, and I'd say that from a country which is, after all, a traditional enemy. But Germany, I think, has been a remarkable story. I could give you some other remarkable stories. I think India has been a remarkable story. China in a very different way. But the key point about the European Union is that it was a voluntary choice of European governments to share responsibility, economically in particular. And it's interesting that it began with the control at the international, or at least at the European level, of the production of two great materials. One was coal, no longer important, but then very important 50 years ago. The other was steel. These were the raw materials on which you base armament, war, military power. And the European Union essentially moved away from that element of power, which was old-fashioned traditional military power, to look at a different structure, one where there was a sharing, particularly at the economic level. The problem for Europe has always been, and still is, and so I'm going to finish in a minute, has always been and still is, the extent to which there should be a political union. We have an economic union, we have a very effective single market, one of the, in fact, I think the largest in the world, with the most interrelationship between different countries who are part of it. The European Union is today, in economic terms, a more powerful force than the United States or any other country or group of countries you can think of. But the political union has been much more difficult, with countries clinging on to their traditions, as they do in Russia, and clinging on to their historical relationships. And what that means is that when you get to a situation which we are in with Brexit, where essentially the United Kingdom has always been only a half-hearted member of the European Union, the reason for that being, to put it bluntly, that it hasn't been occupied, it hasn't been invaded, it hasn't lost in the sense that a country like Germany or France have lost, and therefore doesn't fully understand how great the threats are. And I think to some extent believes it can just wrap itself up in a kind of historic blanket and keep out of these embarrassing, difficult political issues. This is the central issue for a country like this one, a solid, stable country. And that is whether it believes in what I was talking about at the very beginning and will conclude with, which is a way in which you can reconstruct groupings of countries that accept common values, common objectives, common attitudes. We aren't there yet. We aren't there in Russia. We aren't there in the United Kingdom. We have a current battle going on about whether we do or don't become a more enthusiastic and full-scale member of the European Union, or leave it to retreat back to where we were, a group of islands with a remarkable history. You aren't in that situation yet, but you're close. Because already Russia is reluctantly losing some but not all of its influence on Eastern Europe, all but not all of its influence on places like the Baltics and the Balkans. Russia is not a settled member, of course, of the European Union. It doesn't belong to it. But it's not yet settled, and I go back to where I came from. It's true of both our countries. We haven't yet decided where we belong, what we should do, and how we will live with internationalism. And that's the central core of what I hope you'll be discussing at this conference, where you're free to say whatever you think, you're free to express your fears and concerns, your visions and your future, but where essentially what you're doing, I think, is building an important new Russia, but one which understands what it is to live in that very difficult place, the global world.